The theme this year is engaged global citizenship, and that's an important theme for us here at St. Jerome's. And that's because for many, many, many years, as many of you know, St. Jerome's has been committed not only to the pursuit of the academic university aspect of its mission, but also the social justice aspect of its mission. And social justice really is about engaged citizenship. And so it's a pleasure that this year we've been able to bring together a very powerful roster of speakers who will be challenging us to see ourselves not only as local good citizens, but really as citizens of a new reality. I say new reality because I think we're only beginning to understand what it means to be a global citizen. For all too often we've defined ourselves and our identities in very local, at times parochial terms, and we thankfully are beginning to change that. And I don't want to push this theme too much, but perhaps the experience of illness is a good one to remind us of how most of the world does in fact live. It does struggle with illness and disease much more than we do in North America. Don't want to be negative, but it's just a nice thing to perhaps sober our thoughts sometimes. Anyway, on a more positive note, one of the ways in which we have begun at St. Jerome's to encourage our students to really see themselves as global citizenship is by initiating a program 5 years ago that was initiated by the director of the Center for Catholic Experience Lectures series, Scott Klein. He initiated it, and John Benham-Rennick, who is his co-director this year for our lecture series, is now the director of Beyond Borders. It's our Beyond Borders program. It's a program whereby we prepare, I hope we're preparing you, we prepare our students during the fall and winter semester, those who are volunteered and are interested in doing the program, to travel somewhere in the world during the summer where they will not simply be on a holiday, remember that, not just a holiday, but to in fact engage with local communities who have identified themselves as being able to support and are interested in supporting our students coming there and working and learning about life in other parts of the world. Our students this year will be traveling to places like Ukraine, India, Uganda, Peru, and other regions of the world. In order to get to these developing regions, our Beyond Borders students work very hard not only in the classroom, but also in terms of fundraising to cover the cost of their flights, room and board, ground transportation while abroad. Those students, or a number of them, are here this evening with us, and I would ask them to come forward so that you can see them, and I'll ask Lara Vlach to speak a bit about the Beyond Borders program, their expectations, and also a bit about the experiences of students in the past year. Lara.
Thank you, Dr. Tatarin. I'm happy to be up here speaking as one of the 2009-2010 Beyond Borders students. We're all excited and looking forward to this incredible opportunity to volunteer and to learn in our placement country, and to continue our journey to becoming responsible and aware global citizens. As part of the Beyond Borders experience, we have kicked off our fundraising efforts with a bake sale, and we're currently planning a local concert and the creation of a Beyond Borders t-shirt. Tonight, at our table just outside, we're selling Halloween-themed 50/50 tickets. They're 75 cents for one and three for $2, and gift cards for a variety of retail stores and services. For more information, please stop by our table after the lecture. Tonight, I'm also speaking on behalf of last year's Beyond Borders students, as their speaker is also under the weather. And as Dr. Tatarin noted, the Beyond Borders alumni from last year are hosting a dinner and silent auction, which will showcase their experiences abroad through stories, videos, and slideshows. The silent auction will also contain items from local business partners, as well as items from some of our host countries. The dinner will take place on November 27th at the University Club, and tickets for the event are $50. I've also been asked to mention that item donations for the silent auction are being accepted, and that tickets for this event will also be available at the next lecture in this series on November 20th. So for more information about anything we've got available tonight and the dinner and silent auction, please see us outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lara. And I hope we all have an opportunity to support our students in some way, in some fashion, if not tonight, then on other occasions. I'm very, very pleased to introduce our first speaker in our lecture series this year, Dr. Lri Beaman from the University of Ottawa. Dr. Beaman is a Canada Research Chair in the Contextualization of Religion in a Diverse Canada, an Associate Professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa. She's author of Defining Norm, Religious Freedom, and the Limits of the Law, editor of Religion in Canadian Society, Traditions, Transitions, and Innovations, and co-editor with Peter Beyer of Religion, Globalization and Culture. Her research on religious freedom is regularly funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, otherwise known as SSHRC. Her secondary research interest is on religious ritual and tourism, especially labyrinths. Dr. Beaman comes to us from Ottawa, but I think in a very practical and real way. She is originally a Maritimer. She's been out west, and now she's in Ottawa. And I think having experienced the many regions of Canada helps bring a very particular, interesting, and valuable perspective to her research. So, Dr. Beaman, please.
Thank you, Dr. Tatar. I need more light. I'm getting old.
Sorry. Lara, can you check one of those switches with more light, please? Sorry.
There must be light somewhere. There will be light. We're confident. I'm almost afraid to come up here, given the number of missing in action tonight. I feel lucky to have even been able to get here.
We're just waiting to get the lights first.
Sure. Well, they can hear me. They just can't see me. Here we go. Ah, thank you. Thank you to Joanne Benham-Rennick for inviting me as well, and thank you to all of you for coming. I understand this is quite a popular series and that there's a regular crowd, and you should be quite proud of that, to be able to have a series where people regularly come on a Friday night at 7:30 when it's kind of cold and rainy out. It is quite impressive, so thanks to you very much for coming. I'm very honored to have been invited, and I get, of course, to speak about a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I have a short version of my paper, which is 2 pages, and then I have the 24-page version. And I'm told that they'd like me to speak for about an hour. I'll monitor the crowd closely and see if anybody's nodding off, and that will dictate exactly how long I speak. What I'm looking at in my research, and the things that I have the luxury of thinking about, because that's partly what a research chair gets to do, is think about things, and in particular I get to think about religion a lot, which I do love. I think about things like, should Hutterites have to have their photographs on their driver's licenses? Some of you may know that the Hutterite case was decided this summer. And the Supreme Court, in fact, said they do have to, even though it opposes or it's in opposition to their religious views. Should polygamy be decriminalized? Should Sharia law be part of the Canadian justice system? Should a Chinese community center or association be able to expel a member because she's a member of Falun Gong? These are the sorts of things that I think about. Should public civil servants be able to refuse to perform same-sex marriages because it contravenes their religious beliefs? There aren't any easy answers. I don't pretend that there are, but I, as I say, have the luxury of thinking about these things every day. Tonight what I'd like to do is spread out my 2 pages and my 23 pages here. And tonight what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about religious diversity in Canada, some of the things that set the stage, and then to talk a little bit about the crossroads that I think we're at, to talk to you a bit about a number of the models that we have in Canada, and to suggest a possible third model. And this third model will be based in the idea of deep equality, and someone may ask me what deep equality is, and I'll tell you that I'm still working that out, but I'll do my best. So first of all, I'll start with what are some of the parts of religious diversity that we need to think about in Canada? What's some of the context? And so here we have an incredibly interesting set of factors that we need to think about when we think about religious diversity in Canada. First of all, we need to think about, sometimes we hear about the separation of church and state and that Canada is a secular nation. I don't think those things are true. We don't have a separation of church and state. We never have. We've had a kind of quasi-separation or a quasi-establishment, however you want to think about it. And the reason the pieces of evidence that we can pull to support this would be things like the constitutional support for confessional schools. So in Ontario, the support for funding for Roman Catholic schools, and of course in Quebec, the support for funding for Protestant schools, and so on and so forth. We have a mention of God in the preamble of our charter. And there are a number of little things like that, or big things like that, that would indicate we don't have a separation between church and state, certainly not like the United States does. So when you hear that, when you hear people declare separation of church and state, be a little bit suspicious. Don't believe them. And think about it a little bit more fully. The other thing we have is multiculturalism in fact and also in policy. Now, I see you're lucky enough to have Will Kimlicka coming, and he knows far more about multiculturalism than I do. So I'm not going to talk much about multiculturalism. In fact, I sort of rewrote the title of my talk, and which is something we always do and which is really annoying to organizers when you get here and you say, I've called my talk something else. I'm still doing religious freedom at the Crossroads, but I thought rather than talk about multiculturalism or pluralism, I want to talk a little bit about laïcité, reasonable accommodation, and deep equality. So that's the kind of subtitle of my talk. So we have this multiculturalism thing happening. In fact, we are a multicultural nation, and then we have also in our charter a recognition of multiculturalism, and we have the Multicultural Act. How that gets translated is a whole other discussion that you'll have with Will. But we do, in fact, have multiculturalism in some one variety or another. The fact of the matter is that we are a nation made up of immigrants. We are a nation that's made up of many cultures. And ideologically, we support the notion of multiculturalism, however that's interpreted. And I'll talk a little bit about it later. We also have a charter, Section 2A, Canadian Charter of Rights. Section 2A, religious freedom is acknowledged. Under Section 15, you can't be discriminated against on the basis of your religious beliefs. And we have, again, as I mentioned, Section 27, the section on multiculturalism, which suggests that all the charter provisions need to be interpreted in light of the multicultural heritage of Canada, and those are the words from the charter. We also have a sort of Christian dominance in our history, which has influenced our social institutions and our legal institutions. We have also now a set of world events, global events, that have shifted the terrain in terms of how we think about particular religious minorities, including Jews, Sikhs, Muslims, of course, and even groups like Falun Gong or Falun Gong. So that's the kind of context that we're dealing with. Now, what we're seeing emerge is a sort of tension around how it is we should think about religious diversity. For lack of a better word, I'm going to talk about the management of religious diversity. I could also use the word governance of religious diversity. Neither of these terms is particularly satisfactory, but I'll use it just for the sake of conversation. So I'm looking at the management of religious diversity or various religious groups, and how do we manage public claims about religion? How do we manage religious freedom? And we have some models emerging. One of the models is based largely on the model we see in France, and that's the model of laïcité, which is religion is, as much as possible, not present in the public sphere. That we try to erase religious symbols, and we pretend that people don't have religious affiliations except in the private sphere. In the private sphere, people have religion, but in the public sphere, it doesn't exist. So that is the French model. And what we see happening is a tendency toward trying to import at least some parts of that model into Quebec especially. But Quebec isn't the only province where this is happening. Quebec probably most strongly. But so the laïcité, or in Quebec, open secularism, open laïcité model. This is a sort of uneasy tension with religion. So when we see the recommendation in the Bouchard-Taylor Commission report that the crucifix should be removed from the National Assembly, that's what I'm talking about. That sort of attempt to remove signs of religious life from the public. There was a big debate, I don't know if you heard about it, about the cross on the hill in Montreal. Does this mean we have to take the cross down? People said, no. And in fact, the crucifix is still up in the National Assembly as well. So that's one model. The other model that we see that's emerged in Canada is the reasonable accommodation or tolerance model. And this is a model that sort of relies on the notion that we accommodate religious diversity. We tolerate religious difference. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I take issue with both of these approaches, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And the proposal I'll make to you is that we should think maybe about religious diversity in terms of deep equality. That we need to jettison the language of tolerance, which may come as a shock to some of you, but jettison the language of reasonable accommodation. And we need to try to think about religious diversity in a slightly different way. It's not brand new. We have lots of precedent for pieces of this in Canada. So I'm not inventing something that doesn't exist, but I think that we need to talk about it a little bit more openly. So before I start on a little bit of a discussion about the Bouchard-Taylor Commission report, what they were doing, why they were doing it, and why I think it's important, because people's eyes tend to glaze over when you talk about the Bouchard-Taylor report. Like, oh, that was Quebec, it doesn't matter, it's not anything about us. I beg to differ. I think it's very much about us, all of us. So before I start that, though, I want to just engage with a little bit of a caveat, and that is I tend to use legal examples because I have training in law. The primary database that I work with right now is case law, and I tend to look at case law to see what's happening. I think the law, to some measure, reflects cultural trends, reflects who we are as people to some extent, and also allows us some insight into stories and pieces of information that we might not otherwise be able to see. Law is also an important social institution, so I don't want to minimize that as well. I don't want to valorize legal solutions. I don't think that everybody should be trotting off to engage with the law when there's a dispute about religious freedom. But I think one of the things that law does is provide us in a written format with ways that we can look through and see, okay, what were some of the issues? How did people talk about these? How does law, as an adjudicating institution in our society, how does law make this decision? I think it's important to go there. Anything else I can say about law? Some disadvantages. We live in a country that has an adversarial legal system, which means that oftentimes then people are pushed into extremes. And so you see extreme positions sometimes that don't really reflect how the parties might deal with situations if they were sitting across the table one from another. So law can give us a picture of the extremes or the far edges of equality. Not always completely accurate, but it gives us a place to begin. So, Quebec. Let's turn there. Let's talk for a moment about the Bouchard-Taylor report, which was prompted by a number of things that came together in the province of Quebec, but specifically probably the event that was the catalyst is the Multani decision. Now, before I talk a little bit more about that, I just maybe should address a little bit about why I think the Bouchard-Taylor Commission report is important. I think it's important because the Quebec government spent a lot of money to have a public forum in which ordinary people could come and talk about how they felt about religious diversity in a public forum. And the debates that took place in Quebec reflect some of the debates that take place all across Canada. But the advantage of what we see happening in Quebec, and there are some special circumstances that I'll mention, but the advantage of what happens in Quebec is that we get to have a window on those discussions. And we get to have some fairly learned people, because not only Mrs. Bouchard and Taylor, but also the people they consulted think about these issues regularly. And so they write a report. It's a report that's based in a particular political philosophy. There's no doubt about it. But they write a report and they really reflect on, well, what does it mean to talk about accommodation, diversity, to some extent identity, multiculturalism, but for Quebec, of course, the language is always interculturalism rather than multiculturalism. In many ways, what happened with the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, the process of the commission, the report, reflects what's going on in the rest of Canada, but also reflects a global trend. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about multiculturalism being under threat and so on. But what it does, these debates are happening not just in Canada, but in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Germany, the Netherlands. All countries in this sort of Western cohort are wrestling with issues of multiculturalism and religious diversity. And so Quebec takes it on and says, we're just going to open this up and we're going to document this. And there were, I think, 900 submissions to the commission. For that reason, I think it's pretty important to consider what it is they were doing. So they go through this whole hearing process, and what essentially happens now, actually going into my 24-page thing to see where I am. Okay, so Multani is the case that kind of prompts the formation of the commission. There are a variety of reasons the commission formed, but the Multani case is the Sikh schoolboy who asked to bring his kirpan to wear his kirpan to school. And just to describe for you a little bit about what happens in that case, the parents, the schoolboy, the school commission They work things out, and they come to an agreement about how he can bring his kirpan to school, and it's sewn in, and it's covered, and so on and so forth. All kinds of provisions so that the kirpan cannot actually get out of its cover. And it's all agreed, everything's good, all this kind of citizen talking to each other, sitting down at the table, working it out, and then the school board, the next level up, says, no way. So it works its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says he should be able to carry the kirpan to school. And this is what prompts basically there's this sort of media, and a lot of this is prompted by the media, but not completely. The media sort of brings this to the fore, and citizens are saying there's too much accommodation. There's too much accommodation. This guy should not be able to wear his kirpan to school. What's happening to our province? Some of the same discussion that we hear when people let their guards down sometimes outside of Quebec as well. So that's what prompts it. So the Commission has all kinds of findings, and I'm just actually in the process of reading it in both English and French, and the French is a lot slower than the English. But I think it's important to do both because I don't think they say quite the same thing in translation. So the Commission says lots of things. But one of the things that really interests me about what the Commission says is that it says there are two ways to resolve these disputes. The first way is the legal route, formal process, courts decide, rights are invoked, and so on and so forth. And the second way is what they call concerted adjustment, or deliberative democracy, citizen involvement, and so on and so forth. It sounds like a nice idea, doesn't it? We're going to talk, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about this, we're going to work it all out. It sounds great. It sounds like what should happen. And they're really very critical of the formal legal processes. For example, they say, under the legal route, requests must conform to the formal codified procedures that the parties bring against each other and that ultimately declare a winner and a loser. Indeed, the courts impose decisions most of the time. That's usually why you go to court. The legal route is that of reasonable accommodation, which is something that's been worked up in law, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Requests follow a much different route under the second path, which is the citizen path, which is less formal and relies on negotiation and the search for a compromise. Its objective is to find a solution that satisfies both parties, and it corresponds to concerted adjustment. Now, the problem is first of all, they set up this dichotomy. You either go the legal route or you are talking about it like sane, calm human beings. And there's no sort of potential for crossover. But as I'm sure you know, if you're going the legal route, chances are good, like young Mr. Multani, you've been down some of that citizen negotiation before. It's not as though you just decide one day that you're going to plop yourself in court to enforce your rights, usually. Sometimes that happens, admittedly. But oftentimes there's a whole series of discussions and ongoing negotiations before people get to court. And the problem here is that we set it up in opposition one to the other, so the two have no connection, and of course they do. So we have these two practices identified, and then what we have is, as you can probably guess, is that the Commission says, we prefer the citizen resolution route. We prefer that people work out their differences amongst themselves. And the less of this we have in the public, formal legal setting, the better. I disagree with them on that. I don't think people should run to the courts every time they have a problem. But I also think that sometimes people need to know they have legal recourse in order to solve problems that seem to be unsolvable at the citizen level. So we need both. We need people to be reasonable, talking, negotiating, and we also then need people to have a legal solution. So I think this is especially important because of the climate we're living in, and particularly when you look, using the Bouchard-Taylor Commission report, when you look at the sort of groups we're talking about. They're talking about primarily immigrant groups. So immigrant groups, and there's a racial layover, and there's also a religious layover. So what you have to then sort of think about is, how are people who are in that position, perhaps not as advantaged as others, how is it that they can negotiate as effectively as other people might be able to? And that's the reason that I disagree that these are the sorts of things that need to be resolved behind closed doors, so to speak. So I just want to make sure that I've got my points. So they argue then that the citizen is uniquely positioned to deal with issues of religious freedom, but I think this is questionable, particularly given the climate, the fear of the other climate that we seem to be living in at the moment. I've already mentioned that most people turn to some kind of negotiation before they get to the courts, and then I think that they romanticize citizen participation, and I'll read you a little something from the report. It doesn't mean citizen participation, negotiation, and deliberative democracy is important. I'm not saying that at all, but we need both. They say, how can we forget the pride that the interveners, regardless of origin, ethnic group, or allegiance, felt in experiencing democracy live and exercising the highest possible civic responsibility, that is, to attempt through debate to influence the course of events with the conviction contributing to history in the making. And the problem is it depends on who you listen to about whether that's what actually happened, because there are quite a number of groups, particularly immigrant groups in Quebec, who have said this isn't actually what happened, and we didn't sort of feel this. So there's a fairly interesting critique of the process that comes out of some of the critical race theorists in Quebec that I've been kind of listening to a little bit to see, is my hunch right? Is my hunch that maybe this citizen participation thing, work it all out amongst yourselves, is not quite the whole of what we need when we're resolving these? They say also from the standpoint of accommodation, we will emphasize as much as possible individual initiatives and the responsibility of individual and community interveners to encourage deliberation, free initiative and creativity in the analysis and handling of problems. Almost without exception, we will give priority to this type of solution rather than external solutions in the form of new legislation or new organizations. So they recommend a dejudicialization of the process, is what they call it. They justify this partly on the basis of they have three bases, I suppose. First is that it's good for citizens to learn to work out their differences. The second is this path avoids congesting the courts. And finally, the values underlying the citizen route, exchanges, negotiation, reciprocity, and so on, are the same ones that underpin the Quebec integration model. So first, it's good for citizens to learn to manage. This assumes that citizens don't already do this, and that it's a bit of a paternalistic kind of tone, that citizens need to learn to take care of themselves, as though somehow we're not all doing this already. It also assumes then that everybody's equally capable of negotiating and standing up for themselves, and that's not always the case. Secondly, the avoidance of congesting the courts. Well, the fact of the matter is most people can't afford to go to court. Most people can't just launch a lawsuit anytime they feel they've been wronged. And this is an access to justice argument that I think they completely overlook. That for people who are at the least bit impoverished, even middle class, working your way through the court system is extremely expensive. And then finally, it's the values point. The values underlying citizen route and exchange negotiation and are the same ones that underpin the Quebec integration model. The integration model referred to positions multiculturalism as an English-Canadian thing and interculturalism as a Quebec thing. And essentially, the complication in Quebec is this, that you have a linguistic minority situated in North America, but which is trying to protect itself, as we all know, from extinction. So a viable project and a reasonable project in that there is a desire to preserve culture and language by a minority group in the North American context. However, they're a majority group in terms of the immigrants in their province. And so it's a tricky business. And this is why Bouchard-Taylor tried to avoid privileging that core linguistic group in the process of writing this report. But it's a dicey business. It can't really be done because this is the whole premise of interculturalism, that first and foremost is the need to protect a linguistic and cultural group. And so that's the kind of negotiating they're trying to pull off here while they're trying to deal with religious minorities with racial overtones. So it's not an easy job that they're trying to do. I would be the first to admit that. So the problem here becomes that the construction of the problem as they see it and as it was presented during the commission report or during the commission process, is a sort of they, and it's an amorphous they, but usually as a religious minority, racialized other they, are asking for too much accommodation. Or are they? And the Bouchard-Taylor Commission reports basically comes down to this: it's all under control. It's been exaggerated. There's nothing wrong here. Everybody as you were. Let's not really worry about this. So the problem here is that there's an imagined difference that's rooted in the non-Christian other who's asking for what gets characterized as an accommodation or a special right. And although the report points out that not all requests for accommodation come from the immigrant community, it's clear that the circumstances precipitating the creation of the commission are bound up in these assumptions that position an us and a them. And embedded in this is a sense that all is well as long as requests do not take the shape of demands for acknowledgement for formal equality under human rights legislation. That concerted adjustment, you all just fix it up amongst yourselves. The emphasis on the relative lack of formal requests before judicial and human rights tribunals ends with the emphatic statement, the situation is under control. They actually say that. So I've already mentioned that the position of Quebec is unique in that it's home to a minority group that struggles to protect its cultural identity, but at the same time they're part of the European colonizing history. So it's an interesting contrast. One of the people whose work I look at to help me understand the sort of racial embeddedness of this is Shireen Rasak, and she prioritizes race. I think religion has a lot to do with this, so I prefer to sort of keep it as a dual conversation, if you will. But I've looked at the work, for those of you who know her, Shireen Rasak, because I know some of you are here who are working in this area. Shireen Rasak, Sarah Song, Anne Phillips, Sally Engelmary are some of the people whose work I'm reading to try to help sort out what's going on here. But basically they're arguing that there's a construction of an us and a them, and I think it's important to just attend to this for a few minutes. The us and the them gets constructed this way. On the us side is the rule of law. Positioned across the table from that is tradition or culture. Us is modern, they are pre-modern. Us is human rights, they are backwards or Sharia or polygamy. Us is women are equal, they are women are less than or patriarchal. Us cosmopolitan, they are local. We rescue, and here we have particularly around Muslims, the dangerous Muslim man and the imperiled Muslim woman. This is all sort of pieced together from these theorists that I've mentioned. But the Bouchard-Taylor Commission report to some extent relies on this notion in its kind of sorting through, or these notions in its sorting through of how we are to deal with or manage or govern religious diversity. There's always an assumption that there's a them, and this is kind of what the them looks like. Okay, so that's the sort of first problem with the solution that they propose. And the second problem, I've already alluded to it, is that such a citizen-based private mechanism for resolving issues of religious difference fails to address issues of structural inequality, including what might attach to gender. Put another way, parties in these negotiations don't come to the table on equal footing. An employee is vulnerable in a way the employer is not. Immigrants are often vulnerable in ways that others are not. Sometimes there are financial issues. Sometimes there are issues of poverty combined with religion and race. And so there's a vulnerability here that requires, in my view, a public, transparent procedure that at least attempts to come to some kind of just resolution when there's a dispute about religious freedom. At least attempts to, because I know law is not perfect by any means. Bottom-up solutions, then, or the citizens working it out solution, what is sometimes called by political theorists, and I am not one, bottom-up solutions, are only possible in a context when there's a sense of equality or equality of beginning place. This is often not the case for religious minorities, and I would argue particularly, as I already have, when race is coupled with religion. According to a recent Angus Reid poll conducted in Maclean's in May 2009, many Canadians hold negative opinions about minority religious groups. If this is the context in which private negotiation takes place, religious minorities are indeed disadvantaged from the beginning. So that's the sort of first model. It's one of the places we find ourselves at the crossroad. Open secularism, fewer religious symbols, less rather than more conversation about religion, ad hoc private resolution to disputes about religious freedom as opposed to public processes. So that's one of the places we can go. The second place that I want to talk about, just watching my time. Second place I want to talk about is where we are, and these are not necessarily easily separable models. So in other words, you see discussion of accommodation and tolerance in the first model, the laïcité model, or the absence of public presence of religion model, if you will. I'm not quite sure what to call it. You see discussion of accommodation and tolerance, and I think we need to move beyond tolerance. I'm not the only one who's written this. There's a woman named Wendy Brown who's written a book called Regulating Aversion. And I first started thinking about this, and then somebody said, have you read Wendy Brown's book? And I read it, and she really does do quite an exquisite dissection of tolerance. I was also at a conference last year and at Huron College, and one day at breakfast, it turned out the beginning plenary speaker was Lois Wilson, and it was really the former moderator of the United Church of Canada. And I was really interested to hear her say, we've got to get past this tolerance thing, because tolerance is often something that emerges in interfaith dialogue. You see that as sort of the beginning premise for where people begin when they enter into or talk about or advocate for interfaith dialogue. So I was really quite surprised and happy to hear it coming from her lips as well. The call to move beyond tolerance then might come as a surprise to some people. Tolerance has been a central tenet of the liberal democratic approach to diversity. It's been part of interfaith dialogue, as I mentioned, part of legal decisions and public discourse about how to think about diversity. And I'll talk about the work that tolerance does, but I want to lump it together with accommodation, because I think accommodation does the same kind of work. And I'll come back to this in a bit, but I'll just to give you an idea of where I'm headed with this, what does it feel like to be tolerated? Does it feel good if I say, I'm tolerating you? I don't know. I think there's maybe something more we can do with this, moving beyond the idea of tolerating or accommodating, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm worried about accommodation because the notion of reasonable accommodation seems to be infiltrating not only legal decisions, and I'll talk a bit about the history of that in a second, but also public discourse. We're reading in the newspapers, we're hearing people talk about accommodating religious diversity, as though this is a normal and productive way to talk. And I'm not so sure that it is, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. It's the language of the language of accommodation in the adjudication, the language of accommodation in law emerges. I'm going to go to my short notes again here. I'm just trying to speak to this as much as possible rather than read. There we go. Okay, so reasonable accommodation starts to emerge as a principle in law, or as a way to solve problems in law in employment law. And I'm simplifying, but what happens about, I think, the early 90s, late 80s, is you have cases where people who don't belong to the dominant faith, aren't Christian in other words, are going to their employers and they're saying, my day of rest is Saturday, or my Sabbath is Friday. Could I have that off? And this sort of starts a whole discussion about how businesses should handle these sorts of requests. And what the standard that emerges is reasonable accommodation. So the courts, the human rights tribunals, courts come to the place where they say, okay, you should reasonably accommodate unless it causes undue hardship. And that becomes the standard. It also emerges in laws around disability, but these are sort of happening at the same time within human rights discourse. And that's where reasonable accommodation comes from. So in 1996, there's a criticism of this approach that's published by two authors, Sheila Day and Gwen Brodsky, and they call it the duty to accommodate who will benefit. And I read this article years ago, and I started thinking about this accommodation thing. And I just want to tell you I'll take a little short quote from what they say, just to give you an idea of what their argument is. They say, the developing reasonable accommodation framework lacks the capacity to effectively address inequality and foster truly inclusive institutions. It is flawed by its implicit acceptance that social norms should be determined by more powerful groups in the society, with manageable concessions being made to those who are different. As long as this is the framework for accommodation, less powerful groups cannot expect much from it, since accommodation discourse will serve primarily as a means of limiting how much difference the powerful and the majority must absorb. That's their criticism of it. So what happens is everybody seems to ignore the criticism, and reasonable accommodation continues to grow in law, and it starts to expand gradually beyond the borders of employment law. And in fact, in the Multani decision, the Kirpan case, you see the court actually using reasonable accommodation as a way to talk about how young Mr. Multani should be dealt with by the courts. He should be accommodated. And you see also, there are two really important decisions that emerged during this sort of last few years, in the last 5 years. One is Amsalam, and it's the Jewish balcony case, is what it sort of gets shortened to by some of us who talk about it. And essentially it's a case that comes out of Montreal. An Orthodox Jew has a condominium in the condominium complex Le Sanctuaire, which is a fairly high-end condominium that has all of these restrictive covenants. And essentially there's a restrictive covenant against building anything on your balcony. And Mr. Amsalam says, it's the festival of Sukkot. I want to build a sukkah, and I want my own. I don't want a communal one in the backyard. I want my own, and I want it on my balcony. And this is what the case is about. And the Supreme Court decides in his favor. And the Supreme Court says, yes, that religion, it gets really interesting and complicated. Interesting if you do what I do. And the interesting thing is that so there are a number of rabbis called in to give evidence, and some say, yes, you can have your own personal sukkah, it's required, and others say, no, it's not. So there's all this kind of dispute about what the religious requirement is. This is what happens with religion. It's not this sort of uniform, we can say, that's the essence of whatever. That's the essence of being Protestant. That's the essence of being Roman Catholic. We'd like to think maybe, but when you look at how people actually practice, how they live out their faith, it's often a bit of a different story. And that's what the Supreme Court recognizes in Amsalam, and that's why it's important, because the Supreme Court says religion is a lived or a subjective thing, as well as something that exists as doctrine. And that's incredibly important, I think, at least to those of us who study religion, to have an acknowledgement from the Supreme Court that, in fact, religion is more than just something that's written on a page or an orthodoxy or some kind of an essence. That people are involved, real people who do interesting things with doctrine, make interesting changes sometimes. So that's the Amsalam decision in a nutshell. But the thing about Amsalam and what happens in it is the court frames the decision in terms of tolerance. It says, I'll tell you some of the court's words, in a multi-ethnic and multicultural country such as ours, which accentuates and advertises its modern record of respecting cultural diversity and human rights, and of promoting tolerance of religious and ethnic minorities, and is in many ways an example thereof for other societies, the argument of the respondent that nominal, minimally intruded upon aesthetic interests should outweigh the exercise of the appellant's religious freedom is unacceptable. In other words, the fact that you don't want the balconies messed up, too bad. We don't accept that as a reasonable way to deal with something that's as important to people as religion, is what the court is saying. Indeed, mutual tolerance, says the court, is one of the cornerstones of all democratic societies. So we have a court recognition of the importance of tolerance. But I think there are costs to using tolerance rather than equality in framing the reasons to support religious freedom. The language of tolerance and accommodation, and I'll quote Said because I know there are a couple of people here who are using Said and really like him, so Chris. So I'll throw this quote in. Edward Said says, flexible positional superiority, which puts the Western in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient without ever losing him the relative upper hand, says Said. But in their analysis of the notion of tolerance, which is developed in the context of their discussion of sexual orientation and religious freedom, Jacobson and Pellegrini ask, as I asked just a while ago, what does it feel like to be on the receiving end of tolerance? Does it really feel any different from contempt or exclusion? They point out that tolerance is not the same thing as democratic equality, and that freedom and equality, rather than tolerance and hierarchy, are the appropriate response to social difference in democratic society. They also link the notion of tolerance to structural inequality and, importantly, identify its destructive implications for democracy because they say it puts those who take up political activism in any form at risk for charges of extremism or as seeking special treatment. These are my words, as seeking special treatment. And very often, we hear of religious groups who ask to be treated equally as somehow being positioned as asking for special treatment, asking for favors, asking for exemptions, rather than asking for equality. And that's why I'm sort of pushing us towards the language of equality. As I already mentioned, Multani also takes up the baton of tolerance and runs with it. Religious tolerance, says the court, is a very important value in Canadian society. And then later, accommodating G, the young man's name, and allowing him to wear his kirpan under certain conditions demonstrates the importance that our society attaches to protecting freedom of religion and to showing respect for its minorities. This whole language of reasonable accommodation, as I mentioned, partly I think because of the Bouchard-Taylor Commission report, has moved into the public square, and people are using the notion of accommodation more freely and in concert sometimes with the notion of tolerance. So one more bit about accommodation, just to sort of summarize what I think is wrong with it. And I'll just read these are my words, but I'll just read them so I say it the way I want to say it. The reversal that is achieved by the move to use reasonable accommodation is one of discursive framing, moving the person who makes a claim for religious freedom from the position of one who has rights and is equal to a position of one who is accommodated. Some might argue this is a subtle or even meaningless shift, or if the result is favorable, why worry about the intricacies of language? And in both Multani and Amselin, I would say the result was favorable. But I think there are some parallels to those two decisions in that they're both positioned in this notion of accommodation and tolerance. But the shift is not limited in impact to legal semantics, but is both reflective of and reifies a disparity between us and them. The seductiveness of reasonable accommodation is that it appears to be a conceptual framework that is neutral. Moreover, it can, as I just mentioned, lead, as it did in Multani and Amselin, to a positive result. But at what cost? Religious minorities in this framework, whether in law or other institutional settings or popular discourse, are relegated to a less than status, which appears as benevolent generosity rather than equality as of right. And it's really nice to be benevolent, isn't it? So that's the kind of second model or approach that we're dealing with in relation to religious diversity and where we are at this crossroads that I think we're at. So, now to the grand finale, deep equality. I'll see if I can convince you. In thinking about how we might think about religious diversity, I do think it's possible to craft another approach that moves beyond formal equality, you should all be treated the same, and which recenters the conversation from one of tolerance and accommodation to one of equality. This requires flexibility in thinking about how space is created for different religious practices and beliefs. It begins with an assumption of equality rather than with the notion that one group is entitled to give and another to receive. And I want to be clear that deep equality is not something constrained to law. I think that, and I propose it as a guiding ethic, not just in law, but in social institutions generally. There are a number of elements to this thing that I'm concocting called deep equality, including a substantive notion of equality, institutional flexibility, an emphasis on shared ground rather than otherness, and a complex understanding of identity, and finally, agonistic respect. I'll talk about them again. So, what do I mean by substantive equality? So what would a solution based in deep equality rather than accommodation look like? As a preliminary matter, it's important to note that deep equality would look different from situation to situation, or case to case. This is in part a basic premise of substantive equality, that equality does not mean sameness of treatment, but that it can, in fact, employ creative and innovative solutions depending on needs. And here I just get you to sort of think back. I think that one of the most interesting debates around this happened in second-wave feminism and second-wave feminist theory. And really, this sort of emerged from the discussion about employment benefits, maternity leave, and so on and so forth, and the fact that men can't get pregnant yet. And so women are different in that regard, or men are different from women. And that's where this, a deeper, I suppose, I think feminist theory pushed the notion of equality further in thinking about how difference can impact how we think about equality, and that equality does not necessarily mean sameness. So the position, though, in acknowledging or welcoming the other, and here I'm using, just paraphrasing some work by Patricia Markell, who has done some work that's kind of related to what Will Kimka does, what Abigail Eisenberg does, for those of you who know some of these references or know a bit about political theory. In welcoming the other, deep equality seeks to begin from a position of shared humanity and insists on casting into doubt certainties about difference. This position requires humility, or what William Conley calls relational modesty, and at the institutional level, what Abigail Eisenberg calls institutional humility. and a willingness to search beyond usual solutions. It may, for example, require an acknowledgement of sedimentations of power, of one's own privilege, of one's own fears. It may require a reshaping of institutional or conceptual boundaries. It requires a willingness to move past superficial renderings of a situation. And here I think I'll name it specifically, and thanks to the conversation at dinner, I'll just name Sharia law, the discussion around Sharia law. The public discussion was extremely superficial. There was very little engagement with sitting down and thinking about what is this thing and how does it work? And what does it mean? And what does it mean for a variety of different groups of people? It was more a lobbing back and forth in the media, and that was it. So it may require going deeper, difficult conversation, an acknowledgement, for example, of the fact of multiculturalism. It requires a language that carefully navigates power sedimentations without reifying them. It requires language that takes as its point of departure the equality of members of religious minorities. No tolerance or acceptance, or accommodation, pardon me. The second part of this, beyond substantive equality, is institutional flexibility. And here, again, I'll turn to an example from the 80s and 90s, and again from some of the feminist discussions around battered women's syndrome. And I'm thinking specifically about law and the way that law conceptualized self-defense. And law conceptualized self-defense as something that happened between men in barroom brawls. That really didn't apply in the instance of women who lived in abusive situations. And thus, battered women's syndrome in the Leiden case entered into the discourse of how do we think about self-defense in this kind of a situation. And in fact, the law shifted its boundaries and reconceptualized self-defense to think about what if you're not a couple of guys in a barroom brawl or, in the sort of classic scenario. And evaluated the situation of abused women in a different way, to be able to use the language of self-defense in that situation. And I use that example just to sort of illustrate the sort of institutional shift or conceptual shift that might be involved in this desire to move toward equality rather than tolerance or accommodation. Achieving deep equality as a possibility requires a commitment to the idea that institutional structures are, including law, flexible. Sila Benhabib has considered the issues in some detail in her work in a book called The Rights of Others, Aliens, Residents, and Citizens. She argues the process of exercising rights, both the identities involved and the very meaning of citizen rights and rights claimed are, in her words, reappropriated, resignified, and imbued with new and different meanings. End of quote. Moreover, she points out the presence of those who do not share the dominant culture's memories and morals does not pose, and that's kind of what's, if you listen to the values talk that's emerging publicly, that's kind of what the implication is. You don't share values and morals. As she points out, the presence of those who do not share the dominant culture's values and memories and morals does not pose a threat to the culture of democracy, but rather forces a re-articulation of what she describes as democratic universalism. In other words, she embraces diversity and religious diversity and sort of working it out. A point on which she and I perhaps differ is one of emphasis. In the process of thinking about diversity as possibility, we have to be careful not to overemphasize difference, and that's where I want to go next. I want to talk about shared ground a little bit, which is another part of this deep equality thing. In my research with Peter Beyer on immigrant youth and religion, and now immigrant young adults and religion, they're growing up, one of our findings has been that Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist youth look very much like youth outside of those traditions in terms of their concerns, aspirations, activities. Most have friends across faith lines. They're engaged in activities like those of other youth outside of their faith communities. In other words, there's more similarity than difference. And I was thinking about a poll done for the Trudeau Foundation. I think it was last year, and they were polling specifically Muslims, and they asked Muslim immigrants what they liked about Canada and disliked about Canada. And the number one thing they disliked about Canada was the cold weather. Well, hello, similarity. In her research with women living in polygamous relationships in Bountiful, British Columbia, Angela Campbell, who's done some really fabulous research, she's at McGill, has revealed the mundane normalcy of many of the lives of those women. When she went there to interview women, 2 of the sister wives she interviewed had just come back from a vacation in Florida. She experienced kids tugging on their mother's sweaters. Can we go to Dairy Queen now? Can we go to Dairy Queen now? Women talking about juggling school and family responsibilities, worried about how they were going to make meals, what they were going to have, cooking, as she described it, big vats of potatoes that she was fearful one of the youngsters was going to trip into. But really, a pretty kind of ordinary, mundane scene. pretty sharp disconnect between what she found when she went to Bountiful and interviewed women living in polygamous relationships and what we see in the media. And a sharp disconnect between them and the various public officials who would endorse state intervention in that community to the point of dissolving family relationships for the sake of women and children. I offer these two examples to emphasize shared ground rather than difference. Finding points of overlap and shared construction dissolves the otherness and erodes the possibility of constructing an us and a them. This being said, I'm grateful for the work of Shireen Razak, who cautions against the tendency to implode all difference. The point of embracing diversity is that there is difference between groups and people, and hence a need to make space for that difference, not just gloss over it. This is a delicate balance, and I'm still struggling with it in my own work as I think this through. Recently, the discourse of Canadian values has become the new rhetoric designed to displace multiculturalism and institute what I would call a thin pluralism that partners nicely with racism, fear of the other, and the reinforcement of a particular romanticized version of the nuclear family. Values talk has become a way to create boundaries of exclusion. You're either for us or you're against us. There are critics who argue that multiculturalism has acted as a mechanism for the imposition of a liberal democratic project that reimposes a colonial agenda and or creates silos of forced identities that lock minority groups into a less-than position. And I think these are criticisms that need to be carefully considered, but I don't think they end the debate. There's been also a rigorous or a vigorous challenge to multiculturalism from feminist scholars who have argued that women are sacrificed on the altar of multicultural protection. These criticisms raise some valid challenges to the many ways in which multiculturalism as an ideology or state policy has been implemented. However, multiculturalism is a lens through which charter rights are to be interpreted. As I mentioned earlier, Section 27 of the Charter reminds us of the multicultural heritage of Canada. And it can remind us that we must work to find common ground as well as to leave space for difference. It can act as a call to rethink taken-for-granted assumptions about how the world looks and how society is organized. Shared ground means that when religious minorities seek protection under the law, they're not characterized as seeking special privilege or exemption. That was the thinking evidenced in the most recent Supreme Court of Canada decision on religion, and that was in August this year, the Lri decision. More famously, as I mentioned earlier, known as the driver's license case. The court held that changes in Alberta legislation which required Hutterites to have their photos taken was in fact constitutional. It was a reasonable limit on religious freedom. As I've mentioned, some Hutterites believe that having your photograph taken is contrary to their beliefs. In the Hutterite Brethren, the Supreme Court retreats from the broad read of religion religious freedom developed in Amsterdam and Multani. Even though I'm critical of the tolerance and reasonable accommodation discussions in those cases, I do think they're a fairly broad read of religious freedom. The Supreme Court retreats in the Hutterite decision to a narrow approach based on formal equality. The requirement for photographs was ostensibly to prevent identity theft, although, as one of the dissenting judges pointed out, there is no evidence that the 250 Hutterite exemptions had posed any breach of the integrity of the system in the past. 250 people, that's it. That's what the case was about. And they simply did not want their pictures on their driver's licenses. Although, as the case points out, there are 700,000 Albertans whose pictures do not appear in the government database, it's the 250 Hutterites who seem to pose a threat to government security. The shockingly narrow read of religious freedom in Hutterian Brethren, that's the name of the case, can be understood as part of an increased wariness of public institutions toward multiculturalism broadly and religious diversity more specifically. The subtext of the Hutterite decision is that the community is asking for something special to which they're not really entitled. The next piece of this deep equality thing is identity, and then the last will be agonistic respect. So just for those of you who are managing to keep upright, we're almost towards the end. Identity. Identity is important. Religion is important to people's identities. Not everybody's, and that's another worry in the sort of conversation about religion and insisting on religious freedom and new ways to think about religious freedom and religious diversity, that we can possibly move into another space where we insist that everybody has to have a religious position or a spiritual position. That's also a bit of a worry as well. So we have to create space for the religious nuns, if you were. That's N-O-N-E-S. I once told one of my classes that I was a religious nun. And they had a real difficult time with that. I could see them looking at me going, nah, you're not. So the narratives people tell about the ways in which they implicate their faith and their identities are important to attend to. It's important we listen to people's stories about who they are and how faith plays a role in their lives and how they live out their religious commitments. So religious identity can go to the core of group and individual identity. This was the basis of the argument in the Lri case. Why else would you go to the Supreme Court of Canada unless something was really that important to you? It's important to recognize, too, that there's a diversity within religious groups in terms of identity construction. This is sometimes confusing to those of us on the outside of religious groups. So, this is sometimes construed as a misrepresentation on the part of religious groups or members of groups. Oh, you don't really have to wear a kirpan because that Sikh doesn't. You don't really have to wear hijab because that woman doesn't. You don't really have to have your own sukkah because this rabbi says you don't have to. There's disagreement within groups that sometimes spills over into the public sphere. The Muslim Council of Canada has declared that the niqab and the burqa should be banned in Canada. At the same time as we have a case of a Muslim woman who does not want to remove her niqab, fighting to give evidence wearing the niqab in criminal court, and that's making its way to the Ontario Court of Appeal. The difficult yet simple fact of the matter is there's no one truth in these positions, a point that the Supreme Court has recognized. Remember Salam, individuals, how we believe, how we interpret. The Supreme Court has recognized with its emphasis on the subjective nature of religious beliefs and practices. In other words, individuals interpret and live out their faiths in a variety of ways. Some Mormons drink coffee, others don't. Some Christians see drinking alcohol as contrary to their faith, others don't. A deep equality approach recognizes that diversity within religious groups, or recognizes that there is diversity within religious groups, accepts the sincerity of believers, and works to make space for multiple expressions of faith. Last but not least, agonistic respect. I'm almost at my 1 hour. Deep equality requires a generosity of spirit, or what William Conley calls, he's a political theorist, but he does more than political theory, agonistic respect, in which one suspends one's unwavering belief in one's own position and allows for doubt, thus opening space for conversation and shared rather than oppositional experience. It's easy to avoid doing this when one is part of a majority. And if one's part of a minority, it's difficult to suspend suspicion that one will be treated with fairness in the process of the conversation. The recognition of the dangers of majoritarian thinking were recognized in the early post-charter decision of Big M. Mr. Justice Dixon made many sweeping and encouraging comments about religious freedom in that case. A lot of that's been backed off of by the court since, but he said what may appear good and true to a majoritarian religious group or to state acting at their behest may not, for religious reasons, be imposed on citizens who take a contrary view. The Charter safeguards religious minorities from the threat of the tyranny of the majority. I'll end with what I think is an example of the sort of thinking I'm talking about. It employs both the agonistic respect of Conley and the institutional humility of Eisenberg, and it's found in the dissenting judgment of Mr. Justice Binney in the case of AC and Manitoba Director of Child and Family Services. And that's also a case that was released this year in May, I think. It's the case of a 15-year-old Jehovah's Witness girl who refused blood transfusions, and she was ordered to receive transfusions by a court, appealed that order, and eventually the order and the constitutionality of it was upheld by the majority of the Supreme Court of Canada. So they said it was okay to force transfusions. Even though, by the way, there were medical practitioners who said that she was a mature minor and should have been able to make the decision herself. Mr. Justice Binney took a different approach. He noted, the Charter is not just about the freedom to make what most members of society would regard as the wise and correct choice. If that were the case, the Charter would be superfluous. Binney's clear recognition that religious freedom means that even unpopular or unwise decisions are potentially entitled to protection is an important step away from the assumptions about those who fall outside of normative religious frameworks. Mr. Justice Binney's comment is boldly honest in that an admission that a particular practice is outside of one's experience subjects one's own preconceived notions to critical analysis. Of AC, the young woman, he notes, she claims the right to make a choice that most of us would think is a serious mistake, namely to refuse a potentially life-saving blood transfusion. End of quote. Yet, despite the decision most of us would make, and notice how he positions himself in that, Mr. Justice Binney recognizes the importance of moving past a line of reasoning that would mire us in prejudgments and assessments to a careful consideration that is, at its core, based in deep equality. His approach illustrates the sort of self-examination, institutional humility, and agonistic respect in which it's necessary to engage if we are to embrace the possibilities of religious diversity, and to move past a model which privatizes religion, to move past the teeth-gritting pain of tolerance and accommodation, and to embrace deep equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beaman. Dr. Beaman started with the notion of crossroads. Crossroads are challenging places and present us with many, many questions. So I'm sure that many of you have questions, and as is our custom, we invite you now to come up to one of the microphones and to pose any questions you'd like, and Dr. Beaman has graciously agreed to field some of those questions and answer them.
They're too tired. It's Friday night. Is this on? Okay. Sorry. I might fumble this a bit. I'm with you on the notion of deeper quality, and when I think about it, and I've thought over things like this before, but as an individual, I can understand my tools of privilege, and I can do my darndest to relinquish them. How would you propose on a practical level we start moving to deeper quality in a country that's so founded in traditions of the majority? That's a good question. I mean, the practicalities of something, when you move from a theory to the practicalities, are always the difficult part to answer, aren't they? But I think I would just turn you back to that decision of Mr. Justice Binney, really reflecting, where he really reflects carefully on where he is, what he thinks is right and wrong, how he thinks that this young woman should be treated, and makes a decision that goes contrary, in a sense, to this decision, the decision that he would make. How practically? I'll give you another example. Just simply by day-to-day conversations, instead of assuming what people might want because we see them as X, as Sikh, as whatever, as Christian, to ask questions and to engage in conversation about what needs and wants are, instead of us making assumptions. I'm trying to think of the example from the changes in the Elections Act a few years ago, where the chief electoral officer made assumptions about what Muslim women would want, and it really blew up in his face. I felt bad for him. I mean, he clearly was trying to do something that he thought was right, but it was clear. The Muslim women's group said, well, we were never consulted. We were never talked to. So conversation about needs and wants, I suppose, is another practical way to go at it. Just thinking about what happens when you want to have Thanksgiving dinner with alcohol, and some people don't want to be in a room where there's alcohol. Having the conversation about what might be possible. Those kinds of very simple things that can be difficult. There's no doubt about it. I'm not completely naive. I think these conversations can be really difficult. But I think we have to have them. I think we have to, because otherwise, in the Hutterite decision, I see the Supreme Court easily backing away from this reasonable accommodation tolerance, because they've never based their decisions in the notion of any kind of equality. It's always been, we have the right to give. You don't come here as an equal. And I think if we shift that thing, I think if we start there and we really think about that may shift how we interact. I know it sounds a bit idealistic, but I think we're at this crossroads, and that we really need to think carefully about where we are. And you're quite right. Then we need to think, well, how do we make this happen? It's all well and good, this lovely deep equality thing, but how do we actually make it happen? I think you're right. We have to ask those, how do we make it happen questions. But I think the conversation, even we talked about at dinner, Sharia, and having deeper conversations about what does that mean, what are the various positions, and instead of a reaction about polygamy, instead of saying, oh, polygamy, patriarchal, bad, why not ask questions? What do polygamous relationships look like for the people of Bountiful? Because that's a community that's basically opened itself. You can drive right into Bountiful. There's no one stopping you. What do those look like? Instead of saying, oh, well, polygamy is bad. Well, some people would argue that the traditional sort of family model hasn't been exactly the healthiest model either. So then what do we want to talk about here? Do we want to ask questions about, well, what does this look like on the ground? How is it actually playing out, for example, in Bountiful, which is some of the work that Angela Campbell is doing, which is so valuable? What does it really look like? Instead of looking at women with their poofy hairdos and saying, oh, you know, they're all oppressed and submissive, and assuming a submission, then go deeper. One last example, when I was doing my PhD research, it seems like 2,000 years ago now, I interviewed evangelical Christian women on the East Coast. And I was interested in violence against women in those families, but I was also interested in things like, you know, what does it mean to talk about, you know, headship and submission? Because those aren't really part of my vocabulary in relationship to my partner. And I wanted to know. And talking to people about what that meant. How do they live out their daily lives? What does it mean? What does it mean to think about these concepts? And how does it mean? Talking to Mormon women about the priesthood, and that only men can hold the priesthood, and what does that mean? And how does that translate? And does that mean that women are doormats? I don't think so, not based on the bits of fieldwork that I did in those two communities, but asking those questions, going deeper and being willing to go deeper instead of judging right off the bat, to step back and say, okay, how can I better understand what's happening here? Does that answer in part?
Yes, thank you.
Just go over to the left, our left side, your right side.
This might be an easier and naive question, but I don't actually understand how equality not being sameness really works when it comes to religious identity. I guess, so for example, if you take that Hutterite case, there's 250 people who would not have driver's licenses with photographs on them. But then how does that not turn into nobody who wants to have
the slippery slope argument? Yeah,
slippery slope, or just membership in general. If we're making decisions based upon religious membership, even in the case of, well, you know, I'm in a religious family and I'm a minor, and then I am not personally religious. Mm-hmm. So then whose rules take over? Is it my parents or is it mine? And then if I was raised in a religious family, now I'm a major, but I'm still sort of an official member of that religion, whatever that means, then what happens? And I don't understand how that works.
You've asked about 22 questions in that question. You do know that, don't you? I'm going to take the first part of it, actually, and if I think of anything else on the rest of the bits. How do you deal with equality when you don't treat everyone the same? First of all, I say that a sameness model of equality assumes that everybody's on an equal footing, and a sameness model also assumes a certain neutrality to the status quo. And so, for example, in France, if we use, because that's a nice example of this sort of sameness model, it assumes that Roman Catholicism has had no impact on French institutions, none. And it denies the fact that the French government still supports Roman Catholic schools in France. So there's a sort of pretending that's allowed there by saying, oh, we treat everyone the same. And I'm not saying that those things shouldn't happen, and they're not. I mean, it's a fact of French history. This is what it looks like. So it's not to deny those things, but it's to say, okay, this is the lay of the land. So with the Hutterites, I would say that deep equality or a substantive equality would say they shouldn't have to have their photographs. And I don't buy the slippery slope argument. It's always an argument that gets raised, I think, to avoid changing the status quo. And can these things take us in places that might not be desirable? Potentially. But I don't think slippery slope is a reason to just say, we're not going to go there. What harm would it do to have 250 Hutterites who don't have, photos on their driver's licenses? That particular community, that's a core part of their identities. That's a belief that they claim is a core part of their identities. What does it cost us to acknowledge that?
But the law, I still can't get by the idea that the law applies to everybody.
But it doesn't.
But because of, because of case precedents and stuff.
But it doesn't. I mean, that's the thing. That's the great myth about law, is that everybody's treated equally, and they aren't. And partly they're not because of structural disadvantage. I'll give you another example. In the criminal code provisions on sentencing, one of the pieces of evidence or fact or what have you that judges are supposed to consider is whether a person is from a First Nations community. There's been a big hue and cry when that happened because, they're being treated differently and what have you and what have you. But we look at prison statistics and we look at the conditions in which many First Nations people live, and it seems to me that that's a way to sort of at least try to recognize that structural disadvantage. And so the law doesn't treat everybody the same. It never has, and it's a sort of false neutrality that I'm not willing to accept in law. And I say we make law work so that it provides a substantive equality for people.
Thank you very much. I think the greatest gift that human beings bring to the phenomenal world, to God's creation, is their unique diversity. And while we can talk about diversity between religions, within religions, there are varying degrees of suppression of this individual diversity, this unique diversity that each of us brings as a gift to the world. This disturbs me at a time in which the world is becoming increasingly complex. We need the unique diversity of each human being. And if the religion they associate with, when they associate with the broader culture, suppresses that uniqueness. And I'm talking about positive uniqueness, positive diversity, just like I bring that value judgment to religions too. We can talk about diversity of different religions, but there's aspects of diversity that are extremely problematic, and we can see this being expressed in the world. So I think we have to bring in these other factors to our questions of religious diversity. And we have to even deconstruct different religions, their diversity, and say, well, how does this contribute? Obama's used the term higher values, to the higher values that we need as a species to survive. We have to put religions in this context. They have an important role to play in our survival. And right now, they're in a net, it would appear, particularly the extremists, putting our survival of humanity at risk. I was just to finish, I was another meeting earlier today, a workshop by a new program at the University of Waterloo. It's called Knowledge Integration, and there's what's called a developing group called the Dodo Workshop. And really, I mean, the emphasis here is on us trying to move in a direction so we don't become like the dodo. And I feel that our religions have an important role to play here, and right now it's not sufficiently positive.
I don't think I can answer anything there, but I can agree with you and say, yeah. It was really interesting. I gave a talk at the University of Regina, so I'll just tell a story back. Maybe I'll tell two stories. I was at University of Regina, and there were three young men in the audience who kept asking me questions about science. And I said, but can't you just accept that science is the basic knowledge? Science is the basic knowledge. And they were, I've hung out with all kinds of evangelizing groups, and I've never been proselytized to like I was that day. And then afterwards, the three of them came around me, just like these three tall young men. Can't you just acknowledge that science is the basic language? And I said, no, I can't. I said, because I could say to you, okay, science is the basic knowledge, but I'm a social scientist, and when I'm out there and I'm talking to people, they're not telling me that science is the basic knowledge or basic language. Some marry, science and religion in their lives. For some, science is the language. For others, religion is the language. But for me to acknowledge this,
the two have to work together, hand in hand, be integrated even.
Exactly. At least come into conversation one with the other. And then the other story that I'll tell you is on my drive between Ottawa and New Brunswick a couple of weeks ago, as I went back for Thanksgiving, I was listening to the CBC radio phone-in show, and the question was, who are your heroes? Who do you acknowledge as being a hero? And the conversation was going along the lines of, Winston Churchill had a big fan club this day, and lots of callers, and Tommy Douglas, so it's a little more refreshing, and, let me think, I can't tell, I can't remember his name right off the top of my head. Stephen Lewis, yeah, who do you think, who are your heroes? Okay, let's play it here. And then a man called in and he said, Muhammad, peace be upon him, Muhammad is my hero, and you could tell the hosts were not quite sure what to do with this, but they were, okay, tell us why. Because he was peace-loving, and he talked all about Muhammad being peace-loving and so on, and then he used Gandhi's endorsement of Muhammad to say even Gandhi recognized Muhammad as peace-loving and so on and so forth. So that was the end of that, and we had more Churchill calls, and it kept coming, and and then we hear, I think Alexander the Great, he built the first great empire, with emphasis on empire. And I thought, well, this is kind of weird. And then the host kind of chuckles and goes, oh, yes, we should have some distant past in here. Whoa. And then he goes, and that guy who called in about Muhammad, he's wrong. That he's not peaceful. He ordered people's fingers chopped off, and he just it was clear then this was this sort of whole empire valorization thing. And so it was interesting hearing these two stories juxtaposed, but I thought, why would someone need to, when somebody says, this is my hero, and constructs a narrative of peace and love, and he was the first man was very much doing that, identified as a Canadian-born Muslim, and very much constructing this narrative. And the second man needed to call in and destroy that narrative, and to say, that's not who you really are. You are not who you say you are. You are someone else. And that, I think, is partly what you're talking about.
Yes. But in the real world, there are peace-loving Muslims, and there are some that don't love peace so much, of course.
Of course. But that man was calling in to talk about his narrative. And why was there a need? I mean, I guess that's what I'm saying. Why was there a need?
Thank you, Mitch.
Hello. I just noticed that you briefly talked about, just offhand, the interfaith groups and how sort of they take tolerance as their starting point for discussion. Do you feel, just in a very brief sense, that interfaith groups represent a possibility for the agonistic respect that you've talked about, or do you feel that they represent more of or there's a third option, but do they represent also perhaps more of a liberal sort of approach that's more based in tolerance, or do you think that it can go beyond that approach?
Oh, sure. I think it could go beyond. I think it could definitely go beyond tolerance. It all depends on how people frame their conversations with each other. It's interesting to me. I spoke at an interfaith conference once, more than once, but this one was kind of memorable because everybody assumed that I was Christian because I was speaking about religious diversity in the way that I speak. So there were obviously some assumptions made about who was in and who was not in. And then the other thing I noticed, that everybody was happy as long as I didn't talk about Scientologists, Falun Gong, witches, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, sometimes I get a little bit concerned because some of the interfaith dialogue I see is interfaith within specific parameters, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen at all. It just means it's happening within specific parameters, that's all. And I think every bit of conversation that people have that try to understand each other in a deeper way can move towards agonistic respect and deep equality.
One more question.
Thank you. How would deep equality approach the question of people who say war is against my religion, like thou shalt not kill, and that they want to say, I don't want to pay taxes to fund war?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question, and it's been before the courts a number of times in Canada, and every time the court says no, and that you're part of a polity, you're part of a citizenship that has to pay taxes. So I don't know, I'd want to reopen that conversation. I can't say it would do this or it would do that at this second, but I think at the very least the conversation would have to be opened. But by the same token, we'd have to ask questions about things like, do we want people who figure out the proportion of their money that's spent on their tax money that's spent on other things they disagree with to be able to opt out as well? And I think that's where we have to sort of open the whole conversation, and then what is the greater public good and so on and so forth. But I think the conversation hasn't been really adequately had. It's been basically kind of dealt with at a fairly superficial. There's one case, and I know there's another case coming through the courts, I think, at this moment, but I know there was another case, I can't even remember when, probably 10 or 15 years ago, a Quaker man or woman, I can't even remember which, to be honest. It's been so long since I've read the case, that's about all I can remember. And the justification the court gave, in my opinion, was pretty darn superficial. There wasn't a real engagement with how profoundly this person felt about their money, tax money, not being used to fund war. So it's kind of a hedgy answer, but it's the best I can do.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much. The Yeah, because I have to.
You've got to do more stuff just to pack my bags and leave.
Thank you. This evening's lecture is sponsored by the endowment in memory of the late John Wintermeyer. John Wintermeyer was a local politician who in the 1950s stood up and challenged Ontario society when it was at a crossroads. And the challenges were surrounding issues like Medicare, like social services, and believe it or not, like taxation and whether we should be involved as a community in supporting each other. Dr. Beaman's lecture today has brought us to a crossroads with similar challenges. I think many of the questions and many of the possibilities that Dr. Beaman opened for us this evening may not be completely comfortable for many of us, just as Mr. Wintermeyer in his day presented possibilities that were not comfortable for his society. But part of our lecture series, as you know, part of our mandate in the lecture series is to do exactly that, to ask ourselves some profound questions about our current social situations and about our future. So I'd like to, on behalf of all of us, thank you, Dr. Beaman, for having done that and done it very well. I'd also, of course, like to thank all of you for having come this evening. The weather is inclement, and it seems that very often on our lecture night it does happen to be inclement. Last year in the winter, every night it snowed. Every night we had a lecture. So thank you very much for being as hardy a group of Canadians as we all are and having attended. Thank you also to the family and friends of John Wintermeyer who established this endowment with St. Jerome's University. And invite you all, as you leave, to participate in the coffee or tea and cookies that we have out there. Also remember our students who are out there, and also the Social Justice Committee of the Ukrainian, that's my bias, I'm sorry, of the University Catholic Community are selling fair trade coffee, tea, and chocolates. If anyone would like to make those purchases, you're invited to, and we'd be very grateful. And specifically with the Beyond Borders students, they have gift cards and silent auction tickets at their table. There's also a sign-up sheet for our email list if you'd like to put your email down on that to receive email reminders of our lectures. Also, as was on the overhead on the projection system before, information I was asked, and I didn't know all the details, now I do know some details. All the lectures from last year, and as we go forward, all the lectures from this year, are available for audio download from the website for the lecture series. And also, finally, as you go on your way, remember not just Halloween tomorrow, but November 20th is the next lecture, and it will be Dr. William Licca speaking on Canadian multiculturalism, global anxieties, and local realities. And I'm hopeful that Dr. Joanne Benham-Rennick will be here as your host that evening. Thank you very much, and good night.